This screencast is going to be about Cucumber and writing Cucumber scenarios. I'm going to introduce a couple of practices that I've picked up over the years. And we're going to start with a simple scenario as you see it right here. Let me go ahead and run this so you can see what it does. This is going against a puppy adoption agency sample application that I created. And it's just an example app. It doesn't do much, but as you can see, the scenario stopped on a checkout page. In fact, if you look at the description here of what's been running, you'll see that we have a lot of pending steps, some steps that aren't completed. Let's step over and take a look at that page and see what we can learn about it. This is it right here. As you can see, it has a few fields that need to be filled out. It has a button that needs to be clicked. Let's inspect this just a little bit. So as you can see, we have your basic input fields. Here's the name field. It has an ID. If we trace through the remaining elements that we need to interact with, they all have IDs as well, except for the button, and it has a value that we might be able to use to help us locate it. So what I want to do is I want to first of all create a page object that represents this page, and then we'll add code to our step definitions to use that page object. Now, a page object is nothing more than a class in Ruby that represents a page, and it sort of knows about what's on the page, how to interact with the things on the page. Let's create one, and I think after we create it, it'll be much clearer what this thing does. So I'm going to create a new Ruby class. I'm going to call it checkout page. Now, as you saw, it has a few fields on it. One of the fields it has on it is a text field. We're going to call it name. And I happen to know all of the IDs for it. And there you have it. This is the pattern in which you use to define things in Page Object Gem. First of all, you tell it what you want to interact with. The next thing you do is you give it a name. In this case, the name is name, which is how you'll sort of access it going forward. And then the last thing that you'll do is you give it an identifier. How do you want to look it up? In this case, I'm using the ID, and I'm supplying the value. So let me go ahead and fill in a few of the other fields that are there. Let's see, we had an address. We had an email field. We had the pay type drop down. In this case, it's a select list. And we had a button. Okay, so that's all there is to defining this page object. Again, part of the reason why we build these page objects is to isolate ourselves from changes that occur in the application itself. Oop, I just happened to notice that I put that in the wrong directory. That's okay. We can easily fix that. Let's say, for example, that thing that we thought was a button. Later we learned that it was a link styled to look like a button. Well, that's okay, because all I would have to do in that case is just come to this place only and change this to a link. Or let's say that the value for that changes to place the order. Again, I would only have to come one place in my whole code to change it. And that's part of the beauty of it. But it's doing us no good setting here. Let's jump over to our steps and put it to work. Here's the steps as they are right now. As you see, I put the sleep in the last step that completed, basically so that it would pause there momentarily so you could see the checkout screen. Let me go ahead and get rid of that. And let's go ahead and fill these in. On the checkout page, we want to set the name to the name value that's passed in from the step definition. And that's what we do there. And the same with the address and actually all of the fields. And in order to click the button, we basically just say place order. Now let's try to rerun that scenario and see what we get this time. And as you see, it filled in those text fields and dropped down, and it clicked the button. So far so good. This scenario seems to be working. But this scenario has a huge problem. The first problem that it has is that it is very verbose. It is talking about every single button click, every single text keystroke. It has way too much detail for what we're trying to specify. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple of techniques, or 3 techniques to be precise, that I use all of the time to help me get rid of this detail. And these 3, after we're finished with these 3 techniques, we're going to come back and rewrite this scenario the way it should have been written in the first place. So let's give that a try. The first scenario I'm going to write uses the technique that I actually like the least, and it is one in which we use a table in the actual steps. And let me write it first, and then we'll talk about it. There you have it. Now, as you can see in this case, I've actually put a table directly in a step. And what this allows me to do is pass a lot of data to the step all at once. And as you might imagine, what I'm going to be doing is filling in the fields and the drop down and completing that whole checkout page. Why is it that I don't like this approach? Well, the reason I don't like this is because I think it takes away from the readability of the scenario. I've helped clients out, and I've shown up at places where the vast majority of every scenario has tables in them, and they can become very, very difficult to read. And in my opinion, one of the reasons why we build these scenarios is to get our customers to collaborate with us. And if they're hard to read, if they're obfuscated with a lot of tables and technical jargon, then we're far, far, far less likely to get our customers to actually work with us on this. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. I definitely use them from time to time, but I use them whenever they're my only choice to accomplish what I need to accomplish. So let's take a look at another scenario. In this case, I'm going to use something called default data. Now, default data was something that I discovered when I was working on a very large data warehousing project for a company. In that case, we had a lot of data that was input and a lot of data to validate on the output. It was actually an Informatica ETL type project. And when I first arrived, the testing group was running millions of records through the system every night, coming in the next morning, looking at the source for records that match certain criteria, and then trying to trace those through to the target to see if they could make sure that individual business rules were applied appropriately. Needless to say, this was an incredibly laborious and very, very error-prone way to testing. And what I quickly discovered is that each business rule actually only looked at a very few number of fields and just a couple of tables. And the rest of the data, it didn't really care what it was as long as it made its way through there. So I was able to, in the course of about a week, build up a little DSL layered over top of Active Record and Factory Girl that would create these nice, huge sets of default data, pop them into the table, but allow the tester to specify any specific field or column to be overwritten, and then it would run it through the system, and they were able to very easily verify on the back end. After this was done, they were able to write tests in a matter of 4 or 5 minutes to test a specific business rule. It just so happened that the very next project after this was a web project, and I discovered there that the default data works just as well. Let me write up the scenario real quickly. I think we'll learn a little bit more about it as we start to implement the code for this. Here you see I only said NI checkout, and I think that's where the actual magic is going to take place. We'll see how that works here momentarily. The third technique I want to introduce you to is one where we use mostly default data, but we actually interject or have the ability to overwrite pieces of that default data. Let me go ahead and write that one as well. And there we have this third scenario. Now, as you might guess, in the second scenario, we're going to somehow use some default data that's coming from some location. And in the third scenario that we've just finished, we're going to have it also use default data, except we want to be able to override a specific piece of that data and have it make sure that it uses, in this case, a credit card. Okay, well, looks like we've got 3 steps to implement, and let's get started on those. Let's start with this first one and see what that looks like. I'm going to quickly generate the step definition, and here you have it. So as you see, it's passing in something called a table, and this is actually a cucumber object. You don't need to know a whole lot about it in order to interact with it, other than to know that it has a method called hashes that will return an array of hashes. For example, let's take a look at our steps here again. If it has a single row of data like we have here right now, the first hash will contain these values. There will be a key value, key value, key value, key value. Now let's suppose that there was another row of data, then that would be the second entry in the array, and we'd still use the same keys, it's just that the values would be the additional data. Okay, there we have that. Now what I need to do is go ahead and implement the code for this. First of all, I do not have a method on my checkout page in which I can just pass all this data, so I could do something like this. And then do page.name equals etc, etc, etc. But I think there might be a cleaner way to do that. So let's get rid of all that. And let's jump over to checkout page and see what we can do here to help things out. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new method. And let's call it complete order. And I'm going to pass in some data to it. And what I'm going to do with that data is I'm just going to go through and populate all of the fields of my checkout page. So let's do that. And then the last thing that I need to do is go ahead and click the button. And with that in place, I should be able to make my call. And again, what I said is, if you call hashes, it will return an array of hashes. So in order to get the first one, we know we could easily do this to return the first one, or we could just call the first method on it, which will also do the same thing. And with that in place, let's run the scenario and see how it works. And it looks like that one worked. Excellent. So let's go down to the second scenario here and see what it's going to take to implement this new step. Again, I don't have the ability to have my checkout page handle defaults, so let's add that right now. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a set of default values that can be used by the page. And I'm just going to create a simple hash at the top of my page for right now. So there you have that. So now that I have my set of default data that I want to use, I need to be able to modify this checkout method. What I want to do is I want to use the default data if no data is passed in, and if data is passed in, I want to use that data instead. So first of all, let's handle the no data being passed in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a default value to my data parameter, which basically means that if you pass in some data, use it. Otherwise, use, in this case, an empty hash. And now what I want to do is I want to take what is passed in and I want to actually just merge it with my default data hash that I just defined. Luckily, the hash method has a merge method with it, which what it does is it will take the values that are passed in. If it finds a match, it will overwrite the original, and if it doesn't, the original will exist. So let's pop back over to our feature, to our step, and see what it would now take to implement this. By just calling complete order and not passing any values, I'll end up with an empty hash as the parameter, which when it gets merged with the default data, what it will do is it will use just the default data itself. So let's go ahead and run this one and see what happens. And as you see, it worked as well. So now I'm going to to implement this last scenario. Let's generate the step definition. Now, I don't think I have to write any code in my checkout page. All I have to do is pass in the value that I want to be merged with the default data. So let's do that. And I believe with that in place, that is done. Let's run over to our feature, try to run this one and see what happens. Excellent. So again, just to recap, we've created 3 new scenarios here that introduce different ideas that allow us to hide away details, unnecessary details that we really don't care about. And what I'm going to do now is go back to that very first scenario, rewrite it the way that I think that it should have been written in the first place. So let's do that. Okay, when I complete the adoption of a puppy, then I should see thank you for adopting a puppy. So let's go ahead and implement this scenario. Okay, that probably does it. Let's try to run this and see what we get. And would you look at that? It passed. Now you might think I'm done, and if you do think that, well, you're a little wrong. First of all, there's a few things I want to talk about. Over here in this step that we just completed, what you see is I'm actually making calls on methods from other page objects that I had already created. So in this case, I'm navigating through all 4 pages, and so I just wanted to point that out so that there wasn't any confusion. But what I'd really like to do is do a little bit of cleanup of my checkout page. So as you can see, there's actually quite a bit going on here, and I think that there's a lot that we can do to clean this up. I worked with a client one time in which the things that show up on their pages would vary based on which state the end user was in, and I needed to clean up this sort of behavior a little bit, because in some cases we would have a value in one state and that value would not actually show up in another state. And besides, it was just very, very laborious for us to constantly have to provide or to set up all this data. So what I've done instead, what I did was I added another method to the page object gem that kind of goes through, and every place where the key for the hash matches the name of a field that is appropriate for it, it will actually put the data in. And if it finds data that doesn't match, it just ignores it. But let's go ahead and update this method to use that instead. Populate page with, and then you pass in the data, is the name of the method. And by using that, as you can see, we get rid of a lot of details. If we run our tests again, we'll see that it works. Excellent. Now the next thing that I want to really focus in on is all of this default data that we've actually put in our page itself. The challenge here is that, first of all, it gets real messy and hard to maintain over time, number one. Number two, if you want multiple sets of default data, it becomes very difficult to do that within the page. So one of my gems is a gem called Data Magic, and we're going to use it real quickly to clean this up as well. And the way it works is you create YAML files of your test data, and then you have the ability to pull those in as your test run. So let's go kind of create a file for that. And we're going to create a file called default.yaml, and it's in the config data directory. And we're going to give our data a key. And other than that, it's just going to be the same as the data that we've defined elsewhere. So there is a set of data, and let's go over to our checkout page and see what we need to do. Well, the first thing is we need to bring the data magic gem or the method into our checkout page. So we simply include data magic. Next thing we can do is we can actually get rid of all of that default table there, because we won't need that anymore, and instead down here where we said populate page with, and then we merge that out, instead we're going to say populate page with data for checkout page. Now it just so happens that this method takes an additional parameter, which is a hash that can be merged with the data that it finds. And let's run that and see what it does for us. And as you can see, it's nice and clean. It has really cleaned up our page object quite a bit. But there's one other thing that Data Magic can do for us. It can actually randomize the data. Now, randomizing the data is something you may not have thought of before, but if it can truly take any value in a name field, why don't we randomize it? As you scale these things up and you start to run in parallel, it's pretty important to make sure that we don't have any two tests using the same data anyway. So this is a great technique. Data Magic has a whole host of built-in methods that can actually take care of this for us. So I can replace the word cheesy with one of its built-in methods called full name. Now you'll notice that I have the tilde there in front of it. Let's continue down. Street address, okay, very good. How about here? Email address. And for pay type, I can only accept a very specific values for there, but I want to randomize the values that get passed in. So let's do this. Let's pass in the 3, but tell it to randomize it for us. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is I'm going to put a little sleep here in my checkout page. If I can type for 3 seconds, just so you have an opportunity to see what it does for the data. And here it goes. Let's see what happens. And look at the values that it's putting in. Very nice. Let me run it again just so you can see, again, a different set of default data, randomized default data at that. Excellent. So these are the techniques that I use. The last thing that I would suggest doing is I'm going to now go back and delete everything except for the scenario that I want to keep. You see, keeping old code around is a bad idea because it makes our code difficult to read, difficult to understand, and far more complicated to go back and find how to change something whenever we're ready to change it. So as a result, I'm going to get rid of all these steps as well. And believe it or not, whoops, I think I got rid of one too many. Yes, I need to keep this, sorry. Well, this is the fun part of doing a live screencast like this, but now I can probably get rid of everything from here up to the first one. And there you have it. There is my step definitions. There's my feature file, nice and clean. There is my checkout page that I've created, and I'm pretty happy, pretty content with it.